Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Thank you for joining us for looking back at the Harlem Renaissance. We're delighted to partner with the University Library on this program, which is part of the 2024 Community MLK Celebration. The theme for this year is the constant pursuit of justice. Visit the website for calendar events at mlk.virginia.edu. We're fortunate to have, 4 panelists join us today for an informative discussion about Harlem Renaissance, the early 20th century social and artistic exploration. Our panelists will be introduced shortly. Should you have a question during this program, kindly enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Closed caption is available. We're recording this conversation and we'll post it in a couple weeks on the Lifetime Learning website in our vodcast library. Visit engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Now, our moderator for this conversation is Holly Robertson, Curator of Exhibitions at the UVA Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library. She designs and produces exhibitions that offer new pathways to rare and unique collections that the library holds. Holly will introduce our panel. Holly, we welcome you to this Lifetime Learning program. So glad you're here today. The microphone's all yours. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Althea, and for hosting us. I'm Holly Robertson, Curator of Exhibitions with the UVA Library. Today, we're going to be taking you on a virtual tour of our current exhibition, Their World as Big as They Made It, looking back at the Harlem Renaissance. We'll go behind the scenes and beyond the exhibition to examine the research, collections, and production of this highly visual exhibition, looking back at the time and place of extraordinary creativity that's also in conversation with Black artists today. Over 100 years ago, the artistic and political revolutions of the Harlem Renaissance were in full swing. The unmistakable sounds, images, words, and conventions of the era indelibly defined American culture and look great in our exhibition gallery. Featuring the visionary works of writers, artists, and thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance, our exhibition examines the creative and intellectual pursuits that defined Black American identity and political consciousness in the early 20th century. The Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library is fortunate to hold a wide selection of influential books, magazines, illustrations, and manuscripts by these creators. We're so excited to share these collections and the context the exhibition provides to visitors with you virtually today. If you are local to Charlottesville or planning a visit, this exhibition will be on view in the main gallery of the Harrison Institute and Small Special Collections Library through June 8, 2024. Harrison Small is the building just to the left of the newly renovated Alderman Library. Our daily hours vary slightly. Plan your visit by checking out the hours for Harrison Small, and the link will post here. If your plans to visit Charlottesville include the upcoming UVA Black Alumni Weekend in April or the UVA Alumni 2024 Reunions Weekends in late May and early June, we will be offering exhibition tours of looking back at the Harlem Renaissance for each of those weekends. So keep an eye on those schedules and offerings and sign up for those tours. Joining me today are 3 wonderful colleagues, UVA colleagues, without whom this exhibition would not be possible. Marlon Ross is a professor of English at the University of Virginia, teaching and researching on African American literature, gender and sexuality studies, and romanticism. Marlon kindly served as our curatorial advisor as we developed the exhibition, advising us on the relevancy and significance of our collections and helping us to select materials that best represent the historical and creative context of the period. George Reiser is a curator at the Small Special Collections Library, supporting instruction, exhibitions, and collection development. His areas of specialization include American literature and history, as well as early printing, but his love and depth of knowledge of our collections helps us discover the sometimes hidden stories of history makers and amplify the creative process of writers, poets, and artists. Krystal Appiah is the head of collection development at the Small Special Collections Library, where she also serves as curator for Virginia and African American collections. Her research interests include African American history, print culture, women's studies, and the history of education. Krystal is responsible for helping our research community understand our current collections, as well as envisioning the collecting path ahead. And we are so tremendously lucky to have her in that role. And she joins me in dressing up today, celebrating the Harlem Renaissance. Marlon Ross is first up to set the Harlem Renaissance in its time and place. Marlon has instructed, written, and published extensively on the Harlem Renaissance. Two recent books featured here are good reads if you're interested in learning more about the Harlem Renaissance era and Marlon's research. We'll place those links in the chat. Take it away, Marlon.
Thank you, Holly. So I'm just going to give a very brief outline of the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm going to start with the concept of the new Negro. It's difficult to understand the Harlem Renaissance without understanding this historical concept. So we're going to talk about some of the historical circumstances that contributed to the emergence of the notion of the Negro Renaissance in the 1920s. So the concept of the new Negro was emerged in the late 1800s, but it was especially popularized in 1900 when Booker T. Washington and his colleagues published the book A New Negro for a New Century. This concept of the new Negro around 1900 was devoted to Washington's notion of accommodationism. This was an idea that the demand for political rights, for political equality could be set aside, at least temporarily, while the race built itself up in terms of economic self-help, material proof of worthiness for citizenship, working from the bottom, and as Washington said in his famous 1895 Atlanta speech, casting down your buckets where you are in the Deep South, because many Southern African Americans were fleeing north, and part of the bargain that he made with the rulers of the South, with the white rulers of the South, is that African Americans would remain in the South and remain a labor force if he were allowed to build up his institute and also to build up the race economically. So some of the circumstances that alter this Washingtonian notion of the new Negro and create the sense of a Renaissance new Negro include, first of all, the impact of World War I. When the African American veterans returned from World War I, they returned with a sense of renewed commitment and militancy to bringing back equality for African Americans across the nation. And it's wonderfully displayed here in this image of the 369th Colored Infantry marching up Fifth Avenue from downtown up to Harlem in a celebration of the victory of the war. At the same time, the Red Summer of 1919 occurred because of this new militancy. The Red Summer of 1919 was a concept that was promulgated by James Weldon Johnson. It was a series of race riots across the country, whites attacking blacks and blacks fighting back. Next slide. So in addition to the race riots, and in response to these race riots, the two crucial biracial organizations, the NAACP, founded in 1908, and the Urban League, founded in 1910, started to think about how to respond to that violence and also to create a more urgent sense of the new Negroes. These two periodicals were very important in They had periodicals where new Negro materials, new Negro Renaissance materials were published. In addition to the militant response and the return of veterans from World War I and the response to the race riots of 1919, another important factor was the Great Mass Migration and mass urbanization. The Great Mass Migration was the largest internal migration in the history of the United States and remains so. African Americans, there were about 5 million African Americans in the country in around the 1910s when this migration started. The first phase of the migration from around 1900 to the 1930s, almost 3 million. So about half of African Americans migrated from the Deep South, the rural Deep South, to cities, and migrated northward to cities like New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia. With this emergence of the Great Mass Migration, it contributed to the New Negro Renaissance, to the Harlem Renaissance, because it meant that these cities were receiving these migrants, and these migrants were consolidating in segregated neighborhoods, and they were building what were called cities within a city. And African Americans were becoming quickly urbanized and saw themselves as modern. And so the shapers of the Renaissance saw this as an opportunity to create a Renaissance. Of course, Harlem is most famous. It's the most famous city where the Renaissance occurred, and that's why we tend to call it the Harlem Renaissance, although recent scholars tend to emphasize more the notion of the New Negro Renaissance, which we'll talk about in a moment. James Weldon Johnson actually argued that the Renaissance, am I already over time? Argued that the Renaissance was a result of real estate, and you can see in this map it's simply that Harlem was being overtaken by African American migrants. Other contributors to the Renaissance were new forms of popular mass entertainment. This is why it's called the Jazz Age. That included the invention of the lateral cut disc record, the little plastic records that became very popular and that spread blues and jazz into middle-class homes of both Blacks and whites. And of course, this is also the Prohibition era, when segregated venues like the Cotton Club in Harlem, whites flocked across the color line to that club, as well as so-called Black and Tan clubs. These were Black-owned clubs that catered especially to African Americans to hear this new music of jazz. So all of these factors, World War I militancy, the mass migration, consolidation of talented tenth, economic boom, these new technologies, they all contributed to the Renaissance across the country. And two places where the Renaissance was especially prominent were in Chicago's South Side, which was called Bronzeville. And this is a wonderful painting by Chicago artist Archibald Motley Jr. of the Black Belt in Chicago, and you can see the energy and the vitality and the colorfulness that is representing this new city within the city. Chicago was especially known for these publications like the Chicago Defender, and the most important and the largest Black newspaper in the country that promoted the idea of the Renaissance and promoted the mass migration. In addition to Chicago as an important site of the Renaissance, there was also DC, especially the Shaw area, the historic Black area of DC. And Georgia Douglas Johnson was one of the promoters of the Renaissance in DC. And her house, you see at right, she had these Saturday night salons where people involved in the Renaissance from Howard University, and other intellectuals and artists would come and they would talk about the new publications, the artwork, etc. And people visiting from across the country would attend these gatherings. The idea of the salon was very popular not only in DC, but also in Chicago and in Harlem, where the Renaissance was promoted. The Renaissance was not only national in scope within the US, it was also international. In Paris, the African descended people from the colonies and the French colonies in Martinique and Guyana and in Senegal and Africa came together, and they were influenced by the Harlem Renaissance to create what they called negritude. And this was basically the same idea of a new Negro, but it was through the French language and through anti-colonial movement against the French Empire. So these creators in Paris created a journal called L'Étudiant Noir, the Black Student, in 1935, and they translated many of the publications of the American New Negro Renaissance into French, and helped to internationalize the Renaissance. So the Bible of the Harlem Renaissance was Alain Locke's The New Negro, an interpretation, and we have the title page here. Locke was a Howard professor, Harvard trained, the first African-American to receive a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and he was temporarily fired from Howard because he was helping to lead a student protest against the white administrators at the time, and was also trying to get better salaries for Black faculty to equalize it with white faculty. So he was in Harlem in this period of 1925, and he brought together this volume, The New Negro, and this volume was devoted to this new concept of the new Negro, which was a concept that promoted aesthetics, arts, and culture as a way of creating uplift for African Americans. In this volume, he has a manifesto at the very beginning of it, where he describes some of the characteristics of this Renaissance New Negro. And these are some of the concepts here. I'm just going to focus on one of them, the second one listed here. He says that the Renaissance New Negro is a result of the mass migration, all of these people coming to these urban northern cities and being transformed into urbane modern people. So the Renaissance is a result, the new Negro is a result of inner objectives. It's not external forces, external pressures that are creating it. It is the inner objectives of the people themselves. It transforms the psychology of the people, creating self-direction, self-determination, and self-expression. So it's a movement away from the idea that African Americans needed help from the outside to the idea that African Americans were modern people who were making themselves because of their own initiative. So I just want to give a couple of examples of the Renaissance in terms of music and art and literature. Music was, of course, very important. Blues and jazz, as well as the Negro spirit, revival of the Negro spiritual. This is Bessie Smith, who was known as the Queen of the Blues, and she was this extraordinary woman who, on these new recording instruments like the gramophone, became very popular and spread blues not only across the nation, but to Europe and to Africa and to other places. We have on the right, Louis Armstrong's Hot Five Band, the creation in Chicago of urban jazz, which eventually came to New York along with Armstrong when he moved there. And third, we have a new group of classically trained African-American composers like Harry Burleigh here in the middle. And one of the things that Burleigh and others did was to take the traditional Negro spiritual and arrange it for choral production. So it's the melding of what Locke called the folk forms with high European forms of music, of art, and of literature. In art, we see, this is the frontispiece at the right, the Brown Madonna. This is the frontispiece to Locke's volume, The New Negro. And you can see how this melding of European high culture with African-American folk culture is represented. This is an image by a German artist named Winold Reiss, whom Locke commissioned to do the artwork, to design the artwork for the volume. And the fact that he had this European modernist doing the artwork is an indication of the collaboration between white modernists and Black modernists. So the Brown Madonna represents obviously a racialization of the traditional notion of Madonna. And here we have Aaron Douglas's, on the right, Aaron Douglas's wonderful modernist piece called Ancestral. And again, you can see the traditional forms of what Locke called classical African art in the sculpture at the right. Picasso borrowed from African sculpture in paintings like this one in the middle, the damsels, the ladies of d'Avignon, and you see the melding of these things through art in Douglas's. Finally, we have in literature an example of the great art work of the period, Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die. And this poem was in direct response to the riots of 1919. It's written in a Shakespearean sonnet form, again, the melding of high European literature and African-American expression. It's a very defiant poem. The last thing I'll say here is that this poem was so popular. Claude McKay was a porter on the trains going across the country. The first time after he wrote it, he recited it to other poets, to other porters, and it brought them to tears. It became very popular. Veterans across the country were learning it and reciting it, and it became one of the celebrated literary testaments of the Renaissance. That's it for me. I hand it over to Krystal.
Marlon, thank you for providing us with this historical and social context for the era. And now my co-curator George and I will talk about some of the items that we selected to display in the exhibition. And of course, since we're a library, a large part of our collection consists of printed works, books, anthologies, broadsides, sheet music, periodicals. As Marlon touched upon, the Harlem Renaissance was an explosion of artistic and intellectual creativity, which included music, artworks, and political thought. And we've given a nod to these genres and formats in the exhibition, but naturally we have focused primarily on our collection strengths of literary and other printed works. And we're very fortunate that one of the joys of curating an exhibition is taking a deep dive into the collections. And we found gaps and a list of things we wished we had. For example, we wish we had more dust jackets for the books from that era, but we were constantly thrilled to find so many amazing original works. And as we were researching the era and consulting with Marlon, we quickly realized the importance of periodicals in launching new artists and writers and in disseminating their ideas to Black America and beyond. So we went into our stacks and we're happy to find so many issues of these core periodicals. And so we talk about The Crisis, Opportunity, Messenger, and Negro World. And the first three featured a variety of essays, scholarly articles, short fiction, poetry, and artwork. They were all widely read by Black Americans during the era, but represented different ways that Black artists and thinkers conceptualized the Black present and future. So if you just go back to Du Bois for a moment, I'm going to talk about him. Thank you. So as with most analyses of race in America and American cultural and intellectual history in the first half of the 20th century, we had to start with W.E.B. Du Bois. So he was a generation or two older than most of the names that we associate with the Harlem Renaissance, but he was a major influence on them and helped to nurture the talent of many of the famous people we know of. One of the main ways he influenced them was through the publication of his seminal 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk, which inspired writers and activists like Claude McKay and A. Philip Randolph. And this book was a collection of essays that introduced concepts of the color line. He talks about the color. Race is an issue that Americans will need to address in the 20th century. The problem of the 20th century is the color line. And also the concept of double consciousness. And that describes how Black Americans are compelled to navigate a dual identity between being American and African American that was often irreconcilable under white supremacy. And so I was thrilled that we found this within our collection. It was out of print when I was in grad school, but some of our predecessors had purchased this a couple of decades ago. So we're able to include this in the exhibit. And Du Bois is also a co-founder of the interracial civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, more commonly known as the NAACP. And Du Bois had a major impact as editor of The Crisis, which was the NAACP's journal. And although The Crisis was a popular magazine when it was first founded, 1910 to 1920 or so, its status as an incubator for writers began in 1919 when Du Bois appointed Jessie Redmond Fawcett as literary editor. And Fawcett introduced poetry, fiction, and fine arts to the publication, and she helped to launch the careers of young writers and artists, including Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Jean Toomer. So we have a near complete run of The Crisis from 1913 to about the 1950s. And we were surprised when we were looking at them to find that many of the early issues have a Purple University of Virginia library stamp, suggesting that we had acquired them at the time of publication for the circulating collection. And another important periodical was Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, which was published by the National Urban League. And Opportunity originally set out to publish sociological and political treatises on studies conducted by the organization to help African Americans reach economic, social, and cultural equality. Charles S. Johnson, the editor-in-chief, hired Countee Cullen as literary editor in 1926, and Cullen began publishing fiction, poetry, photographic essays, and art from prominent as well as up-and-coming African American artists. And so again, we were very pleasantly surprised to find that we had dozens of issues of Opportunities from the decade of the 1920s, which were bound by year with a cloth buckram library binding, again suggesting that we had collected them contemporaneously. And both the NAACP and the Urban League tended to have a moderate approach to civil rights, focusing on adopting middle-class American economic and cultural values, which you see reflected in the pages of The Crisis and Opportunity. So I'm going to turn it over now to George to talk about some other viewpoints African Americans had expressed through periodicals, and also discuss some of the works we hold by major figures of the Harlem Renaissance.
All right, the next magazine was The Messenger. This was the editors, Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph, met at a socialist rally in 1916 and became lifelong friends and collaborators. They believed capitalism to be the problem of injustice, and that The Messenger was then devoted to socialism and its causes and its efforts. 1919, the U.S. Justice Department called The Messenger the most able and dangerous of all Negro publications. Through the magazine and many of their efforts, they started the first Black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which brought higher wages and better working conditions to thousands. They had long and illustrious careers in civil rights. Chandler Owen, in his later years, was a speechwriter and advisor to presidents. Eisenhower and Johnson, he wrote speeches for Wendell Willkie and Thomas Dewey as well. A. Philip Randolph, among other achievements, was the co-director of the 1963 March on Washington. The next person we're going to talk about is Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey started the organization in Kingston, Jamaica in 1914. His approach to the problem of racial inequality was through Black nationalism, financial independence, and a separation of the races. Garvey moved his organization to Harlem in 1917 and was very successful in attracting large numbers to his organization through rallies and speeches that he gave all over the world. His newspaper, The Negro World, was published in over 40 countries, and we were very happy to find an issue in our collections. We didn't know we had one until we started looking. But this particular issue we found in the John Powell papers that we have in special collections. John Powell was a music composer of international renown. He was also an avowed white supremacist. He co-founded the Anglo-Saxon Clubs of America, devoted to white supremacy. There was actually a chapter in Charlottesville and also on the campus of UVA. But they became friends through their belief that separation of the races was the way to go. So even though one was Marcus Garvey was Black and John Powell was white, they became friends under this issue. This particular issue in the John Powell papers is Marcus Garvey has devoted the entire front page to his friend John Powell. So next, we're going to briefly talk about James Weldon Johnson, which you could spend the entire hour on. He wrote, he was U.S. diplomat, writer, poet, composer, executive director of the NAACP. He wrote the autobiography of Ex-Colored Man anonymously in 1912, and then it came out again under his own name in 1927. Towards the end of the book, the narrator of the novel mentions how much he was influenced by Souls of Black Folks by W.E.B. Du Bois. They also composed a great deal of music. He and his brother Rosamond Johnson, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which became known as the National Black Anthem. They wrote that. The other thing we were happy to discover, or interested to discover, was the importance of anthologies, literary magazines, not only the Messenger Crisis opportunity, but other anthologies. And this was James Weldon Johnson had the first Black anthology, The Book of Negro American Poetry, published in 1922. Yeah. So then we're going to go touch briefly on Elaine Locke, that Marlon's already talked about, but he was first asked to edit a copy of Survey Graphic, an issue called Harlem Mecca of the New Negro. It was the most popular issue ever of Survey Graphic, and came out in 1925. And from that, Elaine Locke expanded that into his book, The New Negro Interpretation, which Marlon has already talked about. Charles S. Johnson from Opportunity Magazine came out with his own literary journal, Ebony and Topaz, in 1927. Due to financial funding, it was only issued in one issue only came out. It had the beautiful cover by Charles Cullen and illustrations inside. But again, it was literary magazine, coalescing, bringing in all these people together, artists, poets, and writers, starting to coalesce and bring this all to Harlem as a force, a musical and artistic force. Next, we're going to talk about Countee Cullen, a famous poet in his time, still. He also had an anthology, Caroling Dust, he put out in 1927. And again, all these artists and poets and writers are all starting to come together through these anthologies. Jessie Redmond Fawcett, literary editor of The Crisis, and Nella Larson, a novelist and short story writer. These we found to be more of the conservative members of the Harlem Renaissance. When they depicted Black life, they tended to depict it through professionals, through doctors and lawyers and school teachers and anything that would put Black life in a good light. But these magazines and these periodicals were bringing young people from all over the country. We were interested and surprised to find where everybody was coming from. So we had Wallace Thurman coming from Salt Lake City to Harlem, Gene Toomer, Washington, D.C., Claude McKay, featured here from Kingston, Jamaica, Gwendolyn Bennett, Giddings, Texas, Langston Hughes, St. Louis, Missouri, Zora Neale Hurston, Eatonville, Florida. And they came with a whole new approach. They wanted to turn their back on all the older generation, and they wanted to depict life as they saw it, not in some idealized form. So this wonderful book, Home to Harlem, with the Aaron Douglas jacket. In this book, a Black soldier comes back from the war, goes back to Harlem where he came from, and was just depicted the clubs and the music, and no apologies for alcohol abuse or whatever that happened to be vibrant about Harlem at the time. Some of these young people gathered into a social group, and they started meeting at Wallace Thurman's apartment, and they came out with their own journal, Fire, devoted to young Negro artists. They gathered together, and they put out this magazine. Langston Hughes wrote of it that the goal of Fire was to burn up a lot of the old, dead, conventional Negro white ideas of the past. And so in this issue of Fire, they took up Black rights, they took up women's rights, they took up gay rights through Richard Bruce Nugent, openly Black gay man in Harlem, and depicted Harlem life as they saw it, and not making any apologies to anybody. Unfortunately, the building that was housing Fire burned down. Thank you, Holly. We don't have a first edition. Very few people do. We were able to get the Beinecke Library to send us down their cover from Carl Van Vechten's library, and then the foreword that was signed to him from many of the artists that worked on Fire. Okay, Langston Hughes. We had a wonderful case with Langston Hughes. We have his first book of poetry that made him famous overnight as the jazz poet. Okay, and then we have the next slide would be Contempo magazine. We very glad to find Contempo magazine when we did our research. It was a magazine out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, devoted to modernist literature mostly, but this particular issue, December 1931, was devoted to the Scottsboro trials and the injustice of the Scottsboro trials. And they invited Langston Hughes to, they printed his poem, Christ in Alabama, in the center. He also wrote an essay, Southern Gentlemen, White Prostitutes, Mill Owners, and Negroes, about the injustice of the Scottsboro trials. We have a letter to his friend, Henry Lee Moon, where he's talking about the visit. They invited him down to Chapel Hill. He came down and spoke to a sociology class. They took him out to dinner, and then there was, the letter is very interesting. There's a wild ride in the nighttime out to a fraternity party that he participated in, and he writes to his friend, in spite of Contempo's Scottsboro issue, when he went to visit, they did not hang me from a tree. Zora Neale Hurston, we found that we had a stylus magazine from her time at Howard University featuring a poem of hers. As well, we have this typescript, one of only two typescripts of Mule Bone, a Negro folk comedy written by Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. This was Langston Hughes' own copy, and the poem, they had issues with each other, but by the end of this poem, and their friendship broke up, and they were never friends again. The play was never performed until 1991 at the Lincoln Theater Center. Lastly, we're going to talk about Anne Spencer. She was the outlier. She's the very influential Harlem Renaissance poet who never moved to Harlem. She stayed in her home, her beloved home and garden in Lynchburg, Virginia. That she set up co-founded a NAACP chapter in 1917 in Lynchburg, Virginia. James Weldon Johnson, as field director, came down to visit her, discovered her poetry. She was not a self-promoter. Soon, many editors, everybody was beseeching her to send them her poems. She had over 30 poems published in various journals through the Harlem Renaissance period. She did not ever publish a book of poetry in her own lifetime, although she was the first Black woman to be included in the Norton Anthology of American Literature. Not until 1973, but we have her own copy on display. Go back to Anne one more time. We got a little more to go with that about that letter. I know we're running late probably, but she wrote this letter to Grace Johnson about the Dyer anti-lynching bill. It's a bill that went before the Congress to make it a federal crime against lynching. It was not passed until, honestly, till 2022, a year ago, a little over 2 years ago. It was held up in the Senate for 100 years. But she's writing about this because they were in support of this bill, the Dyer anti-lynching bill. She wrote to her friend Grace Johnson, the wife of James Weldon Johnson, a natural writer to include in the measure would abolish Jim Crow cars. They are my black beast. Lynching the body is as final as it is undesirable, but the Jim Crow car lynches one soul over and over again. We were fortunate, Krystal and I, to go down to Lynchburg to visit the museum. Sean Spencer, her granddaughter, took us around, and I recommend anyone who wants to go down and check out the museum and the garden in Lynchburg, and maybe you'll be able to see the W.E. Du Bois bathtub as we did. And send it back to Krystal.
Great, thank you. So we were fortunate that publications of the time featured striking artwork on dust jackets on the covers and pages of magazines. Otherwise, our exhibition probably would have just been title pages and a little bit dull. But we were able to feature really beautiful artwork as well, especially the work of Aaron Douglas. He was from Topeka, Kansas, and received his fine arts degree from the University of Nebraska. And while he was in school, he read issues of The Crisis and Opportunity. So just one person that you see is being inspired by those type of periodicals and the earlier people who came before him to move to Harlem and then pursue his art career. And you can see from this sampling of his work that he had a very artistic style, but there are quite a few African influences that permeate his art. And since we don't have recorded music from the era within our collections, we decided to ask our former special collections student worker, Sophie Abramowitz, to create a playlist. Sophie received her doctorate focusing on the music of the Harlem Renaissance from the UVA English department, and Marlon was one of her advisors. So if you come to the exhibition, you'll hear the playlist featuring artists such as Ethel Waters, Victoria Spivey, Cab Calloway, and May Rainey. So feel free right now to take a picture of the QR code, and that'll take you to the free playlist on Spotify. But we'll also share the link in the chat too, if you want to listen to it later. And so to finish this off, I'm going to turn it over to Holly to discuss the behind the scenes work of producing an exhibition.
Thank you so much. I'm going to do this very quickly because we're running out of time. We're going to pivot from the work to curate the exhibition to the task of design and production. We often work for over a year in advance to plan, research, write, select objects for an exhibition. But then we come to a point where we need to decide how to express our exhibition concept in a physical space, as well as promote the exhibition and its ideas in a largely virtual world. As Krystal mentioned, we were greatly inspired by the many first edition dust jackets designed by Aaron Douglas in our collections. His bold graphic style flattened figures into two-dimensional silhouettes. His abstract style, influenced by modern art, particularly Cubism, used a narrow range of color in favor of geometric shapes, concentric circles, and radiant beams. Douglas integrated the rhythms of jazz and elements of African American culture into work. His work, as seen here, with a rural musical scene on the cover of Not Without Laughter, in contrast to the urban skyscrapers and motor vehicles punctuating the streets on the cover of The Walls of Jericho. Gwendolyn Bennett was another major influence on our exhibition design. Her poems, short stories, and illustrations in The Crisis, Opportunity, and other contemporary magazines and anthologies. Bennett spent a year in Paris just prior to designing that July 1926 cover illustration for Opportunity. And from this work, you can understand the influence of her attendance to a Josephine Baker performance in the 1925 Decorative and Industrial Arts Expo, from which the Art Deco style was launched. Her cover is an important example of Black Deco illustration and synthesizes a very feminine take on Art Deco and the Harlem and the new Negro woman, swaying gently to the music above a geometric black and white frieze. While our exhibition looks back at the Harlem Renaissance 100 years ago, it would be an absolute miss not to amplify the work of Black creatives working today, many of whom are also looking back at the Harlem Renaissance. We worked with Jamal Benjamin, a graphic designer specializing in font design, to license his in-process work, Harlem Mech, a font that is clearly inspired by the graphic art of Aaron Douglas. His looking back facilitates our celebration of Aaron Douglas art through font in this modern, creative, computer-based moment. We also featured the font of current contemporary designer Joshua Darden. His neoclassical style corundum font has letterpress origins, and it was designed with prose and poetry in mind. It's a perfect match for our looking back at the Harlem Renaissance. Our exhibition and effort embodies the concept of Sankofa, an African word from the Akan people in Ghana. The literal translation of the word and the symbol is, it's not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. The Sankofa bird appears frequently in traditional Akan art and has also been adopted as an important symbol in African American and African diaspora contexts to represent the need to reflect on the past in order to build a successful future. Beside these graphical elements in our exhibition, we needed a title, something that screamed Harlem Renaissance without just saying Harlem Renaissance. We knew the poets would be our guides, and when we found Georgia Douglas Johnson's 1964 poem, Your World, we initially dismissed it. It was published too late. And yet, with a second look, a looking back, we realized that Georgia Douglas Johnson, an organizer of Washington, D.C. salons and gatherings in the Harlem Renaissance, was likewise looking back at her career, her period of intense creativity, camaraderie, and creative bravery during the Harlem Renaissance, and offering us advice on how to make your world as big as you can. All of these combined lend to us these elements of design and the wizardry of finally selecting a title to give us a look and feel for our exhibition on the Harlem Renaissance. It's a transformative fair use or licensed contemporary looking back, the migration of rural to urban, the swell of jazz and skyscrapers. And it looks great in our exhibition. People enjoy it. They take selfies. It makes for cheerful posters and beautiful websites. The design extends beyond just publicity into how we represent each writer and artist that we feature in our gallery space. It delights visitors too. It allows us to offer visitors something to think about and take away, to take home with them, and look back on long after the exhibition will be over in June. Another important element of the exhibition is the work of contemporary artists in conversation with the Harlem Renaissance materials on display. With support from a grant from the UVA Art Council and with a partnership of Charlottesville New City Arts, we selected 5 artists with connections to Central Virginia to submit proposals for large-scale artwork inspired by the Harlem Renaissance. These works are, of course, as big as the artist could make them and are featured on the back wall of the exhibition gallery. Abrielle Hopkins describes their painting inspired by the poem Hope by Arna Bontemps as a display of that purgatory of hopelessness filled by stillness, melancholy, and despair. And yet hope flashes from above, tearing through the seemingly never-ending abyss via a rip in the canvas. That's hopelessness, impermanence, and fragility, and it forces you to imagine a different existence. Lisa Wolfwork's Three Dark Girls Loved quilt is inspired by Gwendolyn Bennett's poem, as well as the notebook and ledger paper homages to writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. The repeated background image is a childhood Polaroid of the artist with her sisters wearing dresses made by their grandmother. To Be Amongst of Rivers connects and responds to Langston Hughes' poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. The tapestry illustrates African American lineage and connection to the world through the 4 great rivers mentioned in the poem. The 4 corners of the piece tell abstract stories of African American past, present, and futures. Valencia Robbins' Dear Georgia is a visual poem in conversation with Georgia Douglas Johnson's Calling Dreams. As an abstract and representational painter, she describes her work like a poem, reaching for the ineffable, trying to make it legible. And finally, Kimmy Liani is a visual artist working in the mediums of photography, art installation, and her voiceover video installation, which we're showing just in brief here, is also in conversation with Gwendolyn Bennett's poem To a Dark Girl. This piece journeys from an imagined mother speaking to a daughter with the words of the poem, then at that same time, that same daughter speaking to herself while exploring Black girlhood. Beyond the artists, our curatorial team here today, and so many of our library colleagues who lift us up and support our work, we want to thank UVA Engagement and Lifetime Learning for hosting us, and thank all of you for taking time to join us today in your support of our collections and exhibitions. Come on and visit our gallery before we close in June, or if you can't make it, we'll hope to have something online for you soon. Now we're going to pivot to a few questions pre-submitted by attendees during registration. We welcome your questions in the chat. I can see that there are a lot of them there now. We're going to start off with a question from Marlon that was pre-submitted by someone who registered in advance. Marlon, was the animosity between Marcus Garvey and the UNIA and W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP real and intense during the 1920s, or has it been exaggerated by modern historians?
It was indeed real. It's not at all exaggerated. And I'll just take a minute to say that the reason that it was real is because there were very divergent ideas about how to proceed. Both Du Bois and Garvey wanted to consolidate the folk and to uplift the race, but Garvey was a separatist, as George has already pointed out. He even met with the head of the KKK to try to help get them finance Garvey's UNIA movement and to take New World Africans back to Africa. Du Bois was an integrationist. He felt that Blacks had built America and that Blacks needed to stay and fight for equal rights. Garvey was a colonialist. He wanted to go back to Africa, take New World Blacks back to Africa. And actually, in one of his conventions, they appointed him the provisional president of Africa. And this outraged Du Bois, who was an anti-colonialist, and felt that it was just that Garvey was just substituting Europe's colonialism for New World Africans' colonialism over Native Africans. So he could not accept that. There was also rivalry between the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Garvey's organization, and the NAACP. Garvey's organization was actually probably the largest Black organization in the world. They had chapters all over the country, in South America, in Africa, and even some in Europe. NAACP was struggling at that time. It had not yet been able to establish itself as well, especially in the Deep South. But at one point, Du Bois says it's not because of envy that he was attacking Garvey, but because of Garvey's lack of moral of principle. And the last thing I'll say is in 1921, Du Bois published an essay where he was more ambivalent. He said that Garvey was charismatic and that, you know, he had some good ideas, but that he was dictatorial and he had other problems. By 1924, he published an essay called A Lunatic or a Traitor. And he had decided that Garvey was a real threat and an enemy to the ambitious in America. And Garvey responded in 1924 with two speeches that were published as essays, where he attacked Du Bois as a mulatto. Du Bois was not a mulatto, and said that he was one of the so-called leading men that was groveling at the feet of white people. So they went back and forth, and never really reconciled, as Garvey was eventually convicted of mail fraud. And as Du Bois had wished, he said he needed to be either jailed or sent out of the country. He was eventually sent out of the country.
Wow, thank you, Marlon. Krystal, we've got one for you. Ann Spencer in Lynchburg was a friend and sort of adjunct member of the Harlem Renaissance, as we've mentioned. In about a minute or so, can you speak a bit about Ann Spencer's connection to the Harlem Renaissance movement?
Yeah, Ann Spencer knew many of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. Almost quite a few of them visited her home in Lynchburg. We have her collection of her papers here at the Special Collections Library. And we have letters from James Weldon Johnson, who's a close friend of hers, W.B. Du Bois, and others. They're often talking about the great time they had in like her salon in Lynchburg, talking about ideas, discussing poetry. Also, Ann Spencer founded a chapter of the NAACP in Lynchburg, which was quite a brave thing to do since the Black population there wasn't very large. So she's also very involved in civil rights activism. And we have an exhibition upcoming next fall, but will focus solely on Ann Spencer and her influence in poetry, civil rights, and horticulture. She was a very famous gardener as well.
Thank you, Krystal. George, it sounds like there are many great works in our library collection on the Harlem Renaissance. How does our collection compare to that of other libraries?
I don't know a lot of the collections around. I know compared to something like the Beinecke's collection at Yale, ours would not be near that good. The problem was our great American literature collections at UVA. When it came to Black literature in the 20s, especially 20s, 30s, sorely lacking. There had to be some sort of racism involved because you could not find a obscure white writer of American literature in the 20s that was not completely covered with beautiful copies, many editions, and the famous writers of the period and foreign translations that might have 30 or 40 different foreign translations. We've been adding to the collection through the years, but for instance, when it came to some of Jesse Fawcett's and others, we had terrible copies, some of them for the Arthur Curtis James collection, who gave his collection to UVA, but he collected Black literature and history and sociology as a white supremacist, of someone trying to prove that Blacks were inferior. So we had to use some of those copies because that's the only ones we had. And some of them, some of the Zora Neale Hurston books have no dust jackets, which is really terrible because they should all be represented in premier copies, like most American literature in the Special Collections Library. So it was a real, we were kind of shocked to see, and we knew it was bad, but it was some cases really good and some cases really bad.
Thank you. All right, we have so many good questions that we don't have time to get to, so we're going to try to get to those in the chat. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand this program back to Althea. Thank you, Althea, for having us.
Oh, thank you for being here. We've learned so much in this very short period of time, less than an hour. So we appreciate your time today, Holly, Marlon, Krystal, and George. George, you taught us just so much. It was so informative. And you brought the 20th century to life for us. So thank you. Thank you, Krystal and Holly, for dressing up for us today as well. We appreciate that. Audience, thank you for tuning in. I hope you will visit this fascinating exhibit at the Albert Shirley Small Special Collections Library on the grounds of UVA. It's available and open until early June 2024. Holly mentioned that earlier, and we look forward to you joining us at a future in-person or online webinar for lifetime learning. Visit engagement.virginia.edu/learn for more details. I would like to call your attention to 3 upcoming programs. On February 13th, Lifetime Learning will host In the Pines, A Lynching, a Lie, a Reckoning, based on a book by Grace Hale, a historian here at UVA. Also in May 2024, Lifetime Learning will feature a unique learning experience, Georgia O'Keeffe in New Mexico. This will focus on her life and art. Elizabeth Turner in the Art History Department and Stephen Cushman in the English Department will be our faculty experts. Come in, travel with us to New Mexico. UVA Alumni and Parent Program will host the Mississippi River Cruise with history professor Kevin Gaines. You will enjoy a voyage through historical landscapes and architectural wonders on a 9-day cruise on a paddle wheel ship. It should be a great program. Visit engagement.virginia.edu/travel to learn more about this trip and many others. Again, thank you for being with us this afternoon. Stay tuned for more programs from Lifetime Learning, and stay well.